Keanu Reeves has long been considered one of the kindest and most humble actors in Hollywood. He doesn't chase fame, avoids scandals, and stays true to his principles. It seems like everyone respects him. But not Jack Wallace. One of the most provocative TV hosts in America, he has made a career out of putting celebrities in uncomfortable situations, tearing down their carefully crafted images in front of millions. To him, there's no such thing as a perfect person, and tonight, he's determined to prove it by making Keanu his target. Live on air, he pushes, mocks, and looks for cracks in Keanu's flawless reputation. The audience laughs, fueling the tension. But what happens next, no one could have predicted. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. Keanu Reeves stepped onto the brightly lit stage, dressed in his usual understated style. Simple jeans, a black t-shirt, and a worn leather jacket. The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the packed studio. Unlike many Hollywood stars, Keanu never basked in the attention. He simply offered a small, appreciative smile before taking his seat across from the evening's host, Jack Wallace. Jack was one of the most popular late-night hosts, known for his sharp wit and relentless jabs at celebrities. His show thrived on controversy, and tonight was no different. With a smirk, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his cue cards against the desk as the applause faded. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have the internet's favorite wholesome celebrity with us tonight, Jack announced, his voice dripping with playful sarcasm. The man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Keanu Reeves. The crowd cheered again, but there was a subtle undercurrent of amusement. They could sense that Jack had something planned, and many were eager to see how Keanu would handle it. Keanu, as always, remained calm. "Thanks for having me," he said simply, his voice smooth but reserved. Jack chuckled. "Oh, it's my pleasure. You know, Keanu, I have to ask, how do you do it? I mean, in an industry full of egos, scandals, and let's be honest, a lot of fake personas, you've somehow managed to convince the world that you're this perfect, humble, down-to-earth guy. What's the secret?" The question was framed as lighthearted, but there was an edge to it, a challenge. A few audience members laughed, sensing the host's intent. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I don't think there's a secret," he said, his tone even. "I just try to be myself." Jack's smirk widened. Right. But come on, let's be real. No one's that good all the time." He glanced at the crowd, playing to their anticipation. "I mean, do you ever wake up and think, maybe today I'll just push an old lady down some stairs?" The audience roared with laughter at the absurdity of the comment. Even Keanu chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't think that would be very nice," he replied, his voice carrying the slightest hint of amusement. Jack leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. "See, that's the thing, Keanu. You always say the right thing. You never slip up. No wild parties, no messy scandals, no Twitter meltdowns. Honestly, it's a little suspicious," he said, feigning mock concern. "Are you even real?" The crowd laughed again, but this time there was a tension beneath the humor. Jack wasn't just making jokes, he was pushing, testing. Keanu's smile barely changed, but something in his posture shifted. He rested his hands loosely in his lap, his fingers lightly interlocked. Jack continued, eyes gleaming. "You know, some people think this whole Saint Keanu thing is just a brilliant PR move, a calculated image. I mean, Hollywood is full of actors, right?" He grinned. "So, tell us, are you acting right now?" A hush fell over the audience. This was no longer just friendly banter. It was a direct challenge. Cameras zoomed in on Keanu's face, waiting for his reaction. And then something unexpected happened. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He simply sat there, completely still, his gaze steady. The silence stretched for a moment too long, and suddenly, the mood in the room changed. People shifted in their seats. Even Jack hesitated, realizing that the energy had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. Keanu took a slow breath and finally spoke. His response would be something no one in that room would forget. Jack Wallace wasn't just another late-night host, he was the late-night host. His show, Nightline with Jack Wallace, had dominated the ratings for nearly a decade, fueled by his signature brand of sharp wit and unfiltered commentary. His interviews were a mix of humor, confrontation, and carefully planned verbal traps, designed to make celebrities stumble and reveal their true selves. Jack thrived on controversy. He had built his career on making his guests uncomfortable, on exposing their contradictions and pushing them into corners where they had no choice but to admit things they never intended to. His fans loved it. They tuned in week after week to watch actors, politicians, and musicians sweat under the heat of his relentless questioning. Some called him a master interviewer. Others called him a smug provocateur who enjoyed watching people squirm. But one thing was certain, if you sat across from Jack Wallace, you needed to be prepared, because he would come at you, and he would find a way to make you break. Tonight, his target was Keanu Reeves. Jack had done his homework. He had spent the last few weeks preparing for this interview, going through everything that had ever been written about Keanu. The stories were everywhere. Keanu Reeves gives up his seat on the side. A grainy cell phone video, millions of views. A man dressed in jeans and a hoodie quietly stands up, motioning for a woman carrying a heavy bag to take his place. The internet goes wild. Keanu donates most of his Matrix earnings to charity. Reports claim he gave away tens of millions of dollars to crew members and hospital funds. No press conference, no social media announcement, just quiet generosity. Keanu spotted sitting with a homeless man, sharing a meal. Paparazzi photos capture him deep in conversation with a man on the street, no security guards in sight. People call him the kindest celebrity in Hollywood. Jack had seen these kinds of headlines before. They followed a familiar pattern. A star cultivates a reputation, humble, generous, down to earth. Only for the truth to come out later. Sometimes it was a leaked email, sometimes a disgruntled former employee spilling the secrets. Jack had taken down plenty of them before. A few years ago, he had confronted a famous action star on his show, pulling up leaked emails that revealed the actor's outrageous diva demands on set. Private chefs flown in daily, assistants forbidden to make eye contact, tantrums over the wrong brand of bottled water. The internet had exploded. The interview had gone viral overnight. Then there was the pop singer who built her brand on being relatable and just like us. Jack had casually played an old clip of her ridiculing a fan off camera, completely contradicting her public persona. She had stammered through an excuse, but the damage was done. That's what Jack did. He poked and prodded, and eventually the truth, the real, ugly, unfiltered truth, came spilling out. So why should Keanu Reeves be any different? Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something about Keanu didn't add up. It wasn't just the subway story or the charity donations, it was the consistency. Keanu had been in Hollywood for over 30 years, and not once had anyone come forward with a bad word about him. No assistants claiming he was secretly rude, no former co-stars whispering about diva behavior, no leaked audio of him berating someone on set. Those have been the last 15 years of Lin's career, where two of his friends and finally him had not lingered on anything but. In an industry where everyone had skeletons in their closet, Keanu's record was spotless. And Jack didn't buy it. Hollywood was a machine, a carefully constructed illusion where publicists controlled every narrative. Some stars worked hard to appear humble and generous, but behind closed doors, they were just as selfish and ruthless as anyone else. Jack had seen it too many times before. To him, Keanu's good guy image wasn't just suspicious, it was impossible. Jack had planned his attack carefully. He wasn't going to come at Keanu directly. No, that would be too easy to deflect. Instead, he would do what he did best. Set little traps, subtle digs disguised as jokes, and slowly turn up the heat. It would start light, playful. He'd make a few jokes about Keanu's reputation, laughing along with the audience. Then he'd start planting doubts. Come on, Keanu, nobody's that nice all the time. You never get angry? You never feel like just telling someone off? If Keanu laughed it off, Jack would push further. I mean, look at your career. Decades in Hollywood and not a single scandal, not even a little one? That's impressive. almost too impressive. The key was to keep the audience on his side, to make them see his perspective. Once they started questioning, once even a few people in the crowd nodded along, Keanu would have to defend himself. And the moment he started explaining his kindness, the illusion would crack. Jack could already imagine the headlines. Is Keanu Reeves too good to be true? Jack Wallace calls out Hollywood's nicest guy and the internet is divided. Keanu Reeves' perfect image finally gets challenged. This was going to be big. Jack leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie as he waited for the show to start. He was ready. He had no idea that by the time the night was over, he wouldn't be the one controlling the narrative. Because Keanu Reeves wasn't playing his game, Jack was walking straight into his. Jack Wallace sat comfortably in his chair, his signature smirk in place as he tapped his fingers rhythmically against the desk. The audience had settled, their anticipation thick in the air. Everyone in the studio and the millions watching at home knew that this wasn't just another celebrity interview. This was a moment. The kind that could make headlines by morning. The kind that could go viral in a matter of hours. Keanu Reeves, however, looked as unshaken as ever. He sat with a quiet ease, his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely in his lap. Unlike many Hollywood guests who came on Nightline with Jack Wallace, some shifting uncomfortably under the host's intense scrutiny, others forcing themselves to match his sharp wit, Keanu didn't either. He didn't try to command the room, yet somehow he already did. Jack leaned in slightly, flashing a knowing grin. "All right, Keanu," he said, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. "Let's talk about this whole nicest guy in Hollywood thing." A small wave of applause rippled through the crowd. Jack let it ride for a moment before raising a hand to quiet them, his smirk never fading. "I mean, come on," he continued, shaking his head as if in disbelief. "Everywhere I look, it's Keanu gives up his seat on the subway. Keanu donates millions to charity. Keanu buys motorcycles for stuntmen." He turned to the audience, widening his eyes dramatically. "I don't know about the rest of you, but this guy is starting to sound like he was written by a Disney screenwriter." The audience burst into laughter. Some clapped in agreement, others nodded along, clearly entertained by Jack's playful teasing. Keanu, however, simply smiled, a small, amused curve of his lips. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the laughter settle, allowing the moment to breathe. It wasn't a nervous pause or a hesitation. It was something else, a quiet confidence. Jack noticed. He was good at reading people, at sensing their emotional states, at predicting their next moves. Yet Keanu was an anomaly. He wasn't flustered, nor was he playing along like most guests would. He was just there, completely present, completely composed. Jack's grin widened. "All right, let's push a little further. I mean, seriously," he continued, his voice dipping into that perfect balance of humor and provocation. "Are you telling me you've never had a bad day, never snapped at a waiter, never lost your temper in traffic?" He gestured toward Keanu, his eyebrows raised. "Never wanted to just tell someone off?" A murmur of amusement rippled through the audience. Some people exchanged glances as if wondering the same thing. Keanu exhaled lightly through his nose, tilting his head ever so slightly. "I think everyone has bad days," he said, his voice calm, even. Jack's eyes lit up and he pointed a finger at him. "Aha, see?" He turned dramatically to the crowd. "Keanu Reeves, ladies and gentlemen, confirmed to be human after all." More laughter. The crowd was engaged now, completely hooked on the back and forth. Keanu chuckled softly, shaking his head. But he still didn't take the bait. Jack pressed forward, leaning onto his desk. "But really, man, no scandals? No Hollywood meltdowns caught on camera? Nothing?" He waved a hand dramatically. "Because I gotta tell you, the rest of us," he gestured toward the audience, "we're suspicious." More laughter. Keanu's smile remained, but his gaze sharpened. Just a fraction, subtle, almost imperceptible. But Jack noticed it. "I don't know what to tell you," Keanu finally said, spreading his hands slightly. "I just try to treat people the way I'd want to be treated." Jack scoffed, shaking his head. See, that's what I'm talking about. That exact kind of answer. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if revealing a great secret to the audience. You always say the right thing, always perfectly composed. His smirk turned into a full grin. I mean, be honest with me, Keanu. Are you acting right now? The audience let out a collective woo. Some gasped, others murmured excitedly. It was subtle, but the atmosphere in the room shifted. For the first time, Jack had taken a direct shot, not just at Keanu's public image, but at the man himself. Keanu didn't respond right away. He simply sat there, completely still, his gaze steady. The silence stretched for a moment too long, and suddenly, the mood in the room changed. People shifted in their seats. Even Jack hesitated for a fraction of a second, realizing that the playful, easygoing energy he had cultivated had just turned into something heavier, something more real. Keanu took a slow breath and finally spoke. His response would be something no one in that room would forget. The studio had gone quiet. The shift in energy was palpable, thick enough to feel. It was the kind of silence that rarely happened on a show like this, one where the host was known for rapid-fire quips and where the audience was always ready to laugh, gasp, or cheer at his next remark. But now nobody made a sound. Keanu Reeves hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't argued. He hadn't even reacted the way Jack had expected. Instead, he had simply met Jack's challenge with one of his own. Are you? The question still hung in the air unanswered as Jack blinked at him. It was a simple question, but it had landed like a punch. For the first time that evening, Jack Wallace, the man who had built a career on making others stumble, was the one thrown off balance. He let out a short chuckle, shifting slightly in his seat, trying to brush off the weight of the moment. "Oh, come on, Keanu," he said, shaking his head, trying to keep the mood light. "That's a clever dodge." Keanu didn't speak right away. He didn't smile, he didn't frown. He just watched Jack. Not with arrogance, not with hostility, just quiet observation. Jack cleared his throat. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't even murmuring among themselves. They were watching, waiting, completely locked into the exchange. Jack was used to controlling the flow of an interview. He would set the pace, direct the energy, pull the guest exactly where he wanted them to go. But with Keanu, something was different. It wasn't that Keanu was resisting, it was that he wasn't playing the game at all. Jack sat up straighter, forcing a grin. "Okay, fair enough," he said, his voice just a little tighter than before. "Let's try this another way." He turned to the audience, his hands gesturing as if inviting them into the conversation. "People love this guy," he said, motioning back toward Keanu. "They worship him. But let's be honest, nobody's that good all the time." A few chuckles, but not as many as before. Jack kept going. "People have their bad sides, their ugly moments. And yet you," he pointed toward Keanu, emphasizing every word, "you don't have one scandal, not one leaked audio clip of you losing your temper, not one angry tweet, not even a bad restaurant review." More laughter this time. The tension loosened just a bit. Jack seized on it. He leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly, as if sharing a secret. "So what's the deal? Are you just really good at hiding it?" Keanu sighed softly, tilting his head as if carefully choosing his words. "I don't think kindness needs to be suspicious," he said finally. Jack let out an exaggerated laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Oh, come on," he said again, louder this time. "That's a nice Hallmark card answer, Keanu, but let's be real. Hollywood is a business, and in this business, image is everything." He tapped the desk for emphasis. "So is this," he motioned toward Keanu, "up and down? The real you? Or just really good branding?" The question landed heavily. The audience didn't laugh. Jack expected Keanu to deflect, maybe give another quiet, mysterious answer, but instead Keanu did something even more unsettling. He looked at Jack with something close to pity. Jack felt it immediately, a flicker of something deep in his chest, something uncomfortable, though he didn't know why. "Does it have to be one or the other?" Keanu asked. Jack frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Keanu shrugged. "Why do you assume kindness has to be fake?" The audience murmured. A shift. A tiny one, but enough. Jack hesitated just for a second, but it was noticeable. He opened his mouth to respond, but Keanu continued before he could. "Maybe the problem isn't that I'm too nice," Keanu said, still calm, still composed. "Maybe the problem is that you don't believe it's possible." Silence. Not the awkward kind, the heavy kind, the kind that carried weight, the kind that made people think. Jack's smirk was gone. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing every detail. The audience wasn't shifting uncomfortably anymore. They weren't waiting for the next joke. They weren't expecting Keanu to explain himself. They were looking at Jack. For the first time, the late-night host, the man known for tearing apart the Hollywood facade, was the one under the microscope. Keanu had flipped the script, and Jack Wallace had no idea what to do next. Jack Wallace prided himself on control. He wasn't just a host, he was a strategist, a master manipulator of conversation. He knew how to craft an interview like a game of chess, setting up his guest, waiting for the right moment, and then delivering a move they couldn't anticipate. It had always worked, but tonight, something was different. He could feel it. The energy in the room had shifted. The audience wasn't laughing quite as freely anymore. The chuckles had died down. And worst of all, they weren't watching him. They were watching Keanu. Jack forced a chuckle, shaking his head as if the whole thing amused him. "All right, Keanu," he said, adjusting his position, leaning back in his chair to feign ease. "I see what you're doing here." Keanu didn't react. He didn't smirk, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Jack drummed his fingers against the desk, his usual confident rhythm suddenly feeling more like an anxious tick. He threw a quick glance at the audience, like he was bringing them in on the joke. "You're flipping this back on me. Clever, real clever." He pointed a finger at Keanu, wagging it playfully, as if that would reestablish the dynamic. "But come on, man, you have to admit, it's a little unbelievable." Keanu finally moved. A single, slow blink. Then, after a measured pause, he asked, "What is?" Jack spread his hands, his voice rising slightly, as though stating something obvious. "This! The perfect, untouchable, good guy act." A few audience members chuckled, but the laughter was quieter than before. Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if genuinely considering the accusation. "I don't think I ever claimed to be perfect." Jack scoffed, shaking his head, grasping onto the thread of control. "No, but that's the image, isn't it? That's what people believe." He turned to the audience, gesturing broadly. "You guys tell me, what do you think of when you hear the name Keanu Reeves?" For the first time in the interview, there was hesitation. The audience knew what Jack was doing. Some still wanted to play along, others weren't so sure. But eventually, a few voices called out. "Shine, a legend." Jack let out a loud laugh, slapping his desk as if they had just proven his point. "See, you're not just an actor, Keanu, you're a myth." Keanu didn't respond right away. He just sat there, calm, steady, letting the weight of the words settle in the air. Jack turned back to him, his smile thinner now. The edge of confidence in his voice had dulled, but he pushed forward anyway. "You know what I think?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly, making it more intimate, like he was letting Keanu in on some grand revelation. Keanu waited. Jack exhaled, tapping the desk lightly as he thought through his next words. "I think, deep down, you know exactly how the world sees you, and I think you've leaned into it." A low murmur spread through the audience. Jack seized on it. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if delivering the final blow. "The subway videos, the viral stories, the donations, they're all real, right?" Keanu gave a small nod. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. "But here's the thing, Keanu. Nobody stays that unscathed in this business. Not for 30 years. The audience tensed. Jack studied Keanu closely now, watching for any flicker of doubt, any hesitation, any sign that he had finally cracked something open. "So what's the trick?" he pressed, his tone sharper now. "Is it just discipline? Do you have a PR team scrubbing the internet? Or is it something else?" The silence stretched. Keanu exhaled through his nose, his expression still unreadable. Then, for the first time in the interview, he shifted just slightly, leaned forward an inch, his hands still resting loosely in his lap. "Jack," he said, his voice quiet but deliberate, "what exactly do you want me to say?" Jack hesitated, just for a second, but it was long enough. Keanu didn't wait for an answer. "Do you want me to admit that I'm secretly cruel?" he asked, his voice calm, his words deliberate. "That I have a dark side that I hide from the world?" He tilted his head slightly, studying Jack in the same way Jack had been studying him all night. "Would that make you feel better?" The audience let out a collective oof. Jack opened his mouth, but nothing came out, because in that moment he realized something terrifying. He wasn't in control anymore. And worse, Keanu hadn't taken control. Jack had given it to him. Jack Wallace could feel it, the control he once had over the room slipping through his fingers like sand. For years, he had been the king of late-night television, the man who could make or break an interview, who could push just hard enough to get his guests to slip, to reveal something raw, something real. But tonight, he was the one on edge. Keanu Reeves hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't deflected or stumbled, he had done something far more dangerous. He had turned the question back on him. "Would that make you feel better?" Jack felt his stomach tighten. The silence in the studio was suffocating. The audience wasn't reacting the way they usually did. No laughter, no murmurs of agreement, no glances exchanged with knowing smirks. They were watching, waiting, not for Jack to come back with a clever quip, but for Keanu. For the first time in a long time, Jack wasn't the most important person in the room. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. He needed to take control back, needed to land something to get the audience back on his side. He let out a forced chuckle, shaking his head. "Well," he said, shifting in his chair, "that's an interesting response." Keanu didn't reply. He just watched him. Jack wasn't used to being on the receiving end of that kind of scrutiny. He had spent years playing the role of the one who exposed others, who saw through them, picked them apart, challenged them. But Keanu's gaze wasn't challenging. It wasn't confrontation. It was steady. And somehow, that was worse. Jack exhaled through his nose, trying to keep his smile intact. "Look, I'm not saying you have a dark side, Keanu," he said, keeping his voice light, casual, controlled. "I'm just saying, no one's that good all the time." Keanu nodded slightly, as if he understood the point. Then he said, "Maybe." Jack felt a flicker of relief. Finally, some movement, something he could work with. But then Keanu continued. "But what does it say about the world?" he asked, his voice calm, deliberate. "That kindness seems so unbelievable." The air left the room. Jack barely managed to keep his expression neutral. That was not the answer he had expected. The audience murmured softly, the weight of Keanu's words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Jack opened his mouth, but for the first time he didn't know what to say. Because Keanu wasn't just answering his question, he was making a statement, not about himself, but about everyone. Jack's grip on his cue cards tightened slightly. He glanced toward the audience, searching for something, anything that could reset the mood. A smirk, a knowing chuckle, a glance that said Jack got him this time. But there was none of that. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at Keanu. And they weren't waiting for Jack to land his next punch. They were waiting to hear what Keanu would say next. Jack inhaled sharply through his nose, forcing a smile. He had to close this out. He couldn't let the interview end on Keanu's terms. So he did what he had always done best. He went for the laugh. "You really are something else, man," Jack said, shaking his head, forcing a lightness back into his tone. He turned to the audience, attempting one last play, one last effort to regain his grip on the room. "Give it up for Keanu Reeves, the most unbreakable man in Hollywood." The audience clapped, but it wasn't the loud, victorious applause Jack had been hoping for. It wasn't the sound of his win. It was something else. It was respect for Keanu, and Jack knew it. The applause still echoed through the studio, But it wasn't the usual raucous, carefree kind that Jack Wallace was used to. It wasn't the sound of a triumphant late-night host delivering the final blow, or a guest making a self-deprecating joke to diffuse the tension. It was different. It was measured, thoughtful. It was for Keanu. And Jack felt it. He forced a grin, nodding along as the claps died down. "Well, Keanu," he said, adjusting his tie. "I gotta say, this was, not quite where I thought this conversation would go." Keanu, still calm, gave a small nod. Conversations have a way of doing that sometimes. Jack chuckled, but it was thinner now, stretched. He tapped his cue cards against the desk, glancing toward the teleprompter out of habit. He was supposed to transition into a commercial break. His producers were probably screaming into his earpiece by now, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hesitant to move on, because he hadn't won. There was no victory lap, no viral takedown moment, no clip of a celebrity fumbling under pressure. Instead, he had spent the last 20 minutes trying to poke holes in something that, in the end, didn't have any holes. Keanu hadn't fought him. He hadn't defended himself aggressively. He hadn't tried to play the game. He had just been himself. And somehow that had unraveled everything Jack had planned. Jack licked his lips, glancing toward the cameras, then back at Keanu. "All right, well, I guess I'll ask you one last thing before we wrap this up." Keanu nodded. "Go ahead." Jack hesitated for a beat, then sighed. "What's the real secret?" Keanu's eyebrows raised slightly. "To what?" Jack motioned vaguely. "To you. To staying this grounded. To being this person that, frankly, a lot of people don't believe can exist in this industry." Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering. Then he gave the simplest answer of the night. "I just don't think being kind is that hard." Silence. The words weren't grand, they weren't poetic, they weren't designed to be a viral moment, but that was exactly why they would be. Jack exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head with something almost like admiration. "Well," he said, leaning back, "I don't know if I'll ever be able to pull that off myself, but I gotta say, Keanu, you got me thinking tonight." Keanu smiled slightly. "That's all anyone can do." Jack nodded, then turned to the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, Keanu Reeves." The audience erupted into applause, this time louder, stronger, more certain than before. As the show cut to commercial, Jack leaned in, lowering his voice. "You really don't crack under pressure, huh?" Keanu chuckled. "I've been through worse." Jack exhaled a laugh, shaking his head. "I bet you have." And for the first time that night, it wasn't an act. By the next morning, clips of the interview had gone viral. Social media was flooded with discussions, memes, and headlines. Keanu Reeves silences a skeptical host with just one sentence. Jack Wallace tries to corner Keanu, ends up questioning himself instead. Maybe the problem is that you don't believe it's possible. Keanu's words shake the internet. People dissected every moment, every pause, every shift in energy. But the biggest takeaway wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was Keanu's calm, his unwavering belief that kindness didn't need to be justified. Jack Wallace, to his credit, addressed the interview on his show the next night. "Look," he admitted with a small chuckle, "Keanu Reeves might be the only person in Hollywood I can't rattle. And maybe that's not a bad thing." And with that, the world had yet another reason to love Keanu Reeves. Not because he had won, but because he had never needed to.